You get 1 point by winning going first, 2 points by winning going second. Today I'm facing the 5th ladder opponent jjbruh4, playing in the round 5 of the 2022 Summer 1v1 tournament. And oh boy! My territorial setup was terrible in the first game. I saw that it was hard to predict my opponent's army, so I decided to rather place my army in this continent to potentially capture and hold it. Though it wouldn't have been too much of a great idea, as at the end I would either have to leave a lot of troops blocked, which would be a terrible decision, or to unleash my opponent's army towards myself, which wasn't looking too promising either. And also, as you saw, my opponent countered my plan with placing his 6 troops in the back. So I think a better decision for me would have been to try predicting my opponent's biggest army. So anyway, as you saw, that was a mistake for me to do that troop split, leaving 4 troops on which my opponent got the attacker's advantage of 3 troops, so they basically were wasted for me without any good purpose. So I think I should have rather placed my newly gotten troops on my opponent's biggest army and done manual rolls on it. But anyway, when I needed the best luck ever to make a comeback, I've got the worst of it. I lost even 9 troops on my opponent's 6 troops army, and that was the game. After the first game the result becomes 0-2 with my opponent getting the lead. In the second game my opponent let me get a continent, so while he was still going to break it as the first player, that was him about to making to do the troop split and be not so confident on crushing my army. That was obvious for me that my opponent was going to place his army in the spot he did, so I really saw my spot as very great place, with my opponent needing to go 1 extra cut off territory to reach it. And my plan really worked out for me, not only because my opponent was forced to make a troop split, but also because he was forced to switch to manual rolls for the better odds to get the advantage on my army, but they went not in the way my opponent wanted and he lost 4 troops more on that. In my turn I captured both of those continents, but while my opponent managed to break through both of them, in his turn he only received 5 troops while I 6. And then in the next turn, with me capturing those continents, and with my opponent failing to break through one of them, that was really the final hit to him, and with that the result became 2-2 with us being in a draw. In the third game these 2 territories really seemed as the best choices for my opponent to place his army, so I had to make a 50-50 decision where to place my army, and luckily for me I was right with it. So I crushed my opponent's 16 troops army, getting the attacker's advantage of 4 troops, and then I had to make the decision between capturing more territories or straightly going to my opponent's 7 troops army intending to crush it, which at the best case scenario would have been 9 versus 7 troops, and after thinking for a bit I decided to rather go for the territories. And then at the end of my turn I decided to fortify my 4 troops army to that territory to potentially make my opponent more complicating to invade me into both of my continents. And I would say my opponent made a pathing mistake, which at the end led him of not invading me into my second continent. So then that was really the game. The result becomes 3-2. In the fourth game that was really a 50-50 scenario decision for my opponent to correctly predict my army, as those 2 territories were the most obvious for me hiding spots. And like me, my opponent ended up predicting my army, but he got the worst luck ever and lost the 97% blitz roll, losing even 6 troops more than me, and at the end not even getting a card since not capturing even a single territory. So with me capturing those territories I decreased my opponent's territorial troop bonus to 4 troops, and with my opponent failing to break through one of my continents the game was completely lost to him if it wasn't really obvious already. After the first map games the result becomes 5-2 with me getting in a big lead. In the 5th game I went with my favorite spot for the capital conquest on Brazil, which is Mato Grosso do Sul, and my opponent decided to cap in Minas Gerais. And in our turns we were basically capturing and recapturing a bunch of territories. By that I wanted to potentially make my opponent's army kinda blocked, but I didn't really achieve it. A potential mistake for me would have been to invade my opponent through this border, and end up blocking my opponent's capital from myself to not be really accessible to crush it when a suitable moment comes. So by understanding that I was always breaking my opponent into his continent through one of his two other non-capital borders. As the second player I was receiving bigger troop bonuses from the cards, so I really liked my situation as my opponent in the beginning of the game, as the first player wasn't able to create a suitable opportunity to blitz my capital. Then at this moment, with my opponent either not having a set at 4 cards or just not trading it in, I've got a really big percent chance to blitz my opponent's capital, which would have been 84% with a 60 versus 30 capital blitz rule. But I decided to still not take it because as the second player I knew that I will be in a much more favoring position than my opponent. But what I forgot to take into account is a proportion, and what I mean by that, while my opponent will basically have 0% or close to a chance to blitz my capital, my percentage was going to get lower and lower as well. So what I was needing is that I will get an opportunity to trade in a set before my opponent, again before the armies become too big to really go into a stalemate. Right here I was lucky to have a set at 3 cards, but my opponent had it as well, and by seeing how I was close to winning, I would guess he decided to not hoard his cards anymore but to trade in sets as soon as he gets them. So that was really unfortunate, and I started really regretting to not taking the 84% chance blitz rule before. But then luckily the opportunity still came, and right here trading in a set at 3 cards I took the 87% blitz roll and won. The result after 5 games becomes 7-2 with me increasing the lead. In the second game I capped in my second favorite capital spot, which is Goya's, and my opponent capped in Mato Grosso do Sul. I countered my opponent from holding the continent of Sul, which has value of 3 troops, by leaving a bigger army in it after invading it, but without unleashing my opponent's capital army to it. So unless he would have gone all the way around, and by doing that capturing this territory, which would have made his capital more blocked. And this is what actually was my goal going further in the game, of trying to wipe my opponent from the top, so he would finally capture that territory, and with that would have less mobility. But the person who has eventually lost the mobility in this game was me. Also from time to time my opponent tried capturing and guarding the continent of Sul, but I was always able to invade him. And then later, with me having a bigger set before my opponent to get a suitable blitz, I learned from the last game to not repeat the same mistake, so without waiting any further I traded in a set and took the 81% blitz. The result after 6 games becomes 9-2. In the 7th game I've got favorable for the first player Blizzards, so that was very lucky for me. But where I lost my luck was in me crushing my opponent's smaller army of 10 troops and losing 3 troops more than him. Then I decided to still try capturing and guarding the second continent, but that was a mistake. With me getting a bad blitz, I should have played more safely and fortified all of those troops back to my capital. As my opponent immediately took the 89% chance capital blitz roll in round 1, losing 6 troops more than me, but then losing no troops when crushing my smaller army of 3 troops. My opponent ended up having 5s on both of his borders, so with me only receiving 3 troops and having my 5 troops army blocked from the caps, I couldn't really recapture one of them, but I've got very lucky to recapture one of the capitals next turn, but it was still basically 100% blitz roll from my opponent, so he won and the result becomes 9-4. In the 8th game I capped in my favorite Brazil caps spot Mato Grosso do Sul, and my opponent capped in Sao Paulo, which looked very promising to me because my opponent was supposed to get blocked soon once he used his biggest army to recapture the territories. Even if not immediately, then later in the game for sure. But my opponent went with the same strategy, and while in the previous game it was dumb for me by not doing the math to leave my capital quite weak and let my opponent get even 89% blitz, this time my opponent only had 17% chance or like 29% chance if switching to manual rolls for the true random odds. So I would say my opponent this time took a big risk, but maybe it was still the best decision if taking into account his underpromising capital spot. At least I don't think it was good. But maybe it was a mistake for me to capture all of those territories immediately rather than playing less aggressively and more safely, as my opponent actually succeeded in pulling out the same plan for another time, so taking into account that my opponent's capital was in the disadvantageous position, I think maybe I made a mistake by capturing all of those territories in the first turn, but maybe not, because I forced him to blitz me with very unfavorable odds in the first turn, which doesn't even immediately win you the game. So let me know what are your thoughts on that in the comments section down below. Anyway, with my opponent winning, the final result becomes 9-6 with me winning the series. Here's the end of the 5th round, and from the 6th place I ranked up to the 5th one, and here are also 16 people who advanced to the next round. It's player limitation. Now if you're interested in checking out the full tournament series, then click on the playlist at the top right, and if you're interested in watching more 1v1 competitions in general, then click on the playlist at the bottom right.